Hello, my quilting friends. Leah Day here with episode 36 of the podcast. And today I'm taking on another great quilting debate, whether to pre-wash your fabric or not. So I love to pre-wash my fabric. It's the first step in the quilting process, in my opinion, but that is not a universal opinion. Some people bring fabric home and they don't wash it, they don't starch it, they don't do anything to it. They just bring it home and start cutting into it. So I really want to take this on and talk about kind of the upsides and downsides of pre-washing fabric. And of course, there are times when you absolutely cannot pre-wash fabric. So we'll talk about that too. So a little update about what's going on around the house. I have finally reached a state with this particular room in my house, and I know it has got to be cleaned up. If you're watching the video, you can see this horrible, messy room that I'm in. If you'd like to see a picture of it before I get started, then you can, of course, check out the show notes and see the total state of chaos that this is. So this is the downstairs laundry room. This is where Dad and I prep up all of our fabric before we start cutting it into quilts. And it's kind of turned this into a dyeing station / leather station / fabric painting station. It's kind of, a very multi-use space, and there's a lot of storage going on here. But obviously there's not that much storage going on. There's just a big giant mess all over the table right now. A lot of projects strewed all over the place, and I really need to start putting some stuff away. So that's what I'm going to be doing as I talk through the introduction today and share what's going on around the house. I'm going to be cleaning up. So if you hear me clattering around, that's what I'm doing. I am trying to find places for everything to go away. I do this occasionally. I make big messes. I leave my toys out, and then it starts to drive me crazy, and I've got to clean up in order to get everything straight and back again, because I really can't work in chaos. It doesn't work for me. I really like things to be neat, but I'm not a particularly neat person. So it's one of those contradictions, I guess, of my personality, is I love to make messes, but then I hate the mess. So I'll be cleaning today. So what's been going on? I have been traveling this past weekend. We went to Charleston to visit some family, had a great time down there. Josh and I took care of all of the cooking, and my sister did all the cleaning and organizing and had a big party. And so we had our Thanksgiving feast already done and taken care of on Sunday night versus Thursday night, which is the traditional day for Thanksgiving. So that felt really good. It felt good to get it all taken care of. I love hanging out with family and seeing all my nieces and nephews. That was a lot of fun. James had a good time hanging out with everybody. I think we all just had a really great little mini vacation. And I was really happy because right before we left, like literally 5 minutes before we left, I finally got the last proof in for my book, and I was able to place the big giant order. And that was a big relief. So if you've ever placed an order for 1,000 of anything, it's a scary prospect. And I've been kind of sweating it out. If you saw the introduction for last week's podcast about Quilt Market, you'll know that I was pretty stressed out and it was kind of scary, and I was doing a lot of back and forth right at the last minute, which is frightening. But we finally got it all sorted out. The books came in. They look amazing. They look awesome. And so I was able to place that order with confidence, knowing it's going to come in, it's going to look great, and all 1,000 copies are going to be perfect. So that felt really, really good. It's hard, to deal with stuff like that right at the last minute and just not really know what's going to happen with everything. And so definitely learned a lot for next time. I'm going to allow myself about a month and a half cushion on placing that big order, so that way hopefully that won't happen again, and hopefully it'll be an easier process. But the thing I do know though is publishing, creating new products yourself is always going to be stressful. I don't care how you slice it. I don't care how you make it. Even when you go with a traditional publisher and you have them do everything for you, it's still a scary, risky proposition, and there's still stuff on the line, and it's still up in the air, and I believe in having more control over the process rather than less. So look, moving forward, I know we're learning InDesign and we're learning Illustrator and now tackling these programs that I have never really wanted to learn before, but it's time that we learn how to do it ourselves. And that feels good too. So I'm looking forward to that, and then being able to produce books that much faster and more frequently is really my goal. And I could not be happier with how everything has gone. And yes, you can still pre-order a copy of my new book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. So pick it up right now and you'll get a signed print copy if you go with the print version. I'm going to be sitting down signing some copies for at least the next, several days. Once they get in, I'll be basically just sitting at the kitchen table signing away. So make sure to pick up a copy if you want it signed. We've got some other pre-order bonuses, so go and check that out at leahday.com/walkingfoot. So another thing I've been working on is my little embroidery. This is a In the Hoop embroidery project. I shared it with you last week. Make sure to watch last week's episode so you can see it. I'll also share a picture of this in the show notes. So this is stitched with blueberry thread and pear. So it's like a dark blue thread, and it's a landscape. So it's kind of swirling water landscape in the sky, and then there's a crescent moon, and then pear is a really bright green color for the landscape. On the back, I've got more swirling water here on the back, more blueberry thread. And it's in the hoop, which means that it stitches out the zipper too, all of it completely in the hoop of your embroidery machine. And it's fully lined. I know, I'm such a nerd. Once I figured out how to get everything layered right and positioned right and taped down and all the steps kind of sorted out, I really did. I did a happy dance. I was super, super happy with it. And so this is finished. This is finally done. And now I have to just batch out the files and it's ready to go. So that feels really exciting too. You can get really stuck with stuff. And that particular project got stuck with just fears, just being afraid of not doing it right, or not being, good enough to do it right. I don't know where all that came from, but I just kind of got stuck with it and then didn't finish it, just never took those final steps to stitch it out and figure out what was wrong and make those corrections. So it is very clear to me that I have been collecting a lot of leather stuff, and I really need to get down here and start using this stuff and playing around with it. I've also got tons and tons of bag hardware by Annie. By Annie.com. It's a wonderful, wonderful bag hardware, and I really need to start playing with this stuff rather than just buying it and hoarding it. I love it, and I really want to challenge myself to make more really nice bags, especially using leather or using cork. We were talking about cork last week. From Quilt Market. Cork is huge, and it's a great leather alternative. It kind of stitches very similar to leather, but obviously without having to kill any cows. So yeah, I think that cork or leather tutorials would definitely be something fun to do next year. So coming up, we've got the Black Friday to Cyber Monday sale, and that's going to be at leahday.com starting Thursday. So it goes from Thanksgiving to Cyber Monday, which is the Monday after Thanksgiving. You'll be able to find really great deals on lots of tools and supplies, plus 50% off. Yes, 50% off all of our downloadable products. That is books and workshops and our embroidery designs and quilt patterns. So definitely come to leahday.com and check that out. Our Thanksgiving to Cyber Monday sale. So come and support the project and stock up on any quilting tools and supplies that you're going to need for the Christmas season. We have some new thread kits that are coming out just for the sale, and they're going to be up, so come and check it out, leahday.com. And now here's the episode all about pre-washing fabric. Hello, my quilting friends. Leah Day here with a new great quilting debate. Every other week, I pick a new topic that quilters like to argue about and talk about it, share my opinion, and a little bit maybe about the quilting history to try and explain and give some perspective. So the debate that I want to talk about this week is pre-washing fabric. So this is kind of a confusing term. I don't particularly love the word pre-wash because it really doesn't describe. Basically what you're doing is just washing your fabric before you cut it, before you piece your blocks, before you make your quilt top. So essentially it's not pre-washing, it's just washing your fabric. But I think that the word pre-washing just came from like pre-putting your quilt together maybe. I'm not sure where that came from. But it was something that I started hearing about a lot when I first started quilting. Oh, do you pre-wash your fabric? And it seemed like there were a lot of people that were like, no, I don't pre-wash my fabric, and a little embarrassed to admit that. And then there were a lot of people that were very defiantly, yes, of course I pre-wash all of my fabric, and very adamant about it being a very important part of the process. Now, when I first got started, I really didn't know what I was doing, and I got started not pre-washing my fabric at all. So I would bring it home from the store and immediately start slicing into it to make my next quilt. Well, it didn't take very long before that got me into a lot of trouble. So my very first quilt that I created, I did not wash any of the fabrics. And it was a combination of blue and white, very, very dark navy blues and solid white fabric. And it did not take long for those dyes to bleed. And this is the reason, and kind of the reason why I pre-wash all of my fabrics, because it really only has to happen once. You only have to get burned once before you learn your lesson and you really start trying to figure out how that can never happen again. So that's really why I love to pre-wash my fabric. I don't want to have that question mark of, is my quilt safe to wash or not? I want to know that I can just throw my quilt in the washing machine and throw it in the dryer and not have to worry about it. So I am one of those adamant, you must pre-wash your fabric kind of people, or at least I believe firmly in pre-washing all of it. And the main reason is for the bleeding dyes. Fabrics, no matter what kind of fabric it is, they can have excess dyes added to the surface that, basically those dyes just kind of haven't bonded, haven't locked into the surface of the fabric, and they're just going to be held on by some light cocktail of chemicals, basically. And, and then sometimes fabrics are cheaply dyed and there's not enough soda ash, that is the chemical bonding agent to cotton fabric. There isn't enough soda ash added to the water, and so it appears like a dark saturated color, and it starts to wash and the dyes start to bleed and bleed and bleed. And then by the time it's finally stopped bleeding, you're actually left with a very light color in the end. Now, that's not typical at all of really high quality fabrics. Please don't be terrified if you've made a quilt and you've not pre-washed it. I just think it's a really important habit to build. So fabric comes home from the store. This is my house, okay? I'm going to describe what I do in my house. Buy some fabric, comes home from the store. It immediately goes into a pile next to the washing machine. And Dad and I, one of us will, kind of shove it all in the washing machine and wash it with light colors. So if I've got a lot of reds, then I'll wash a whole load of reds. If I've got a lot of blues, I'll wash a whole load of blues. I've kind of picked up over the years, there's certain fabrics that I can mix and match. So I can sometimes get away with green and yellow going together. Sometimes I can get away with oranges and yellows going together. They don't necessarily bleed as badly. Blue, purple, and red seem to really be the worst bleeders. And that's why anytime that I'm working with any of those fabrics, especially when I'm combining with them with white, I make sure they get washed multiple times. And I always check my fabrics too, so that when they're washing, I put in like a 10-inch square of white fabric goes into the wash with them. that square then comes out at the end. And if it's discolored in any way, those fabrics get washed again and again and again if it has to be. One tip that Dad picked up over years of doing this with me is to wash with a little bit more water. And instead of doing a small load, like let's say you only have a yard or two to wash, instead of doing a small load on your washing machine, going ahead and set it to a medium load. So that way it's filling up with more water. That's more water to encourage the dyes to bleed more, and that's more agitation. And it also, you can set it to hot water. Hot water will encourage the fabrics to bleed too. You want the bleeding to process out. You want it to get all the excess dyes out. So that way they're no longer there. They're no longer a question. They're no longer potentially going to ruin your finished quilt. A chemical that's really nice to use, if you can find it, is Saranthropol. It's essentially a detergent, and it helps to encourage excess dyes to escape from your fabric. So if there's, a pesky dye molecule that's kind of hanging out on the fabric, Saranthropol will help to suds it off and disperse it into the water and then wash away, versus staying in the quilt to potentially bleed into other fabrics later on. So Saranthropol is a good chemical to try. It's basically just a detergent. Be careful, make sure to read the bottle so you don't use too much. It can tend to form a really, really strong lather. So unless you want suds, coming out of your washing machine, make sure to only use a little bit with every load. So we usually use Saranthropol when we're washing batiks and solid fabrics, particularly reds, blues, purples, definitely. Generally with prints, we don't really have very much of a problem. And so, if you're working with prints, kind of just start to get a feel for the fabrics that you like the best. And if you start noticing, hey, I washed this and with only one wash, I didn't get any bleeding dyes on my white square of fabric. And, I managed to get away with washing yellow and green together, this light yellow and that green or whatever. And no bleeding happened there. You can start to get a feel for what you can get away with. And this is why I think it's kind of pretty cool to work in fabric lines. It's something that I started doing as a designer, just simply because, sometimes I need to work with only Island Batik fabrics. Sometimes I need to work with only Kona cotton fabrics. And that worked for me as a designer, but it also works for me as all of those fabrics are generally going to feel the same. They're going to pre-wash the same. If I know I'm working with batiks, I know it's going to be few more washes, a little bit more time in that pre-washing process, just simply because batiks tend to bleed a little bit more. If I'm working with some prints and I'm familiar with those prints and I know that they can be washed in one wash, then that makes it that much faster and easier to process. Okay, so that's pretty much my process and how I bring fabric in. I wash it, throw it in the dryer. I don't hang my fabric or anything special. I just go on ahead and dry it. Now, let's say that fabric was just destined for the shelf. Like I don't have a plan for it. I don't have some great project in planning. Then I just go on ahead and put it away wrinkled. I don't starch it, I don't press it, I don't do anything to it after it comes out of the dryer. It just goes on the shelf wrinkled. And I think that's the best way to store it, until I know what I'm doing with it. It doesn't need any extra chemicals added to it. And once you pre-wash, it definitely does soften things up. So this is one of the main reasons why quilters don't like to pre-wash. When you get fabric from the store, it's got that slight hand to it. It's a little bit stiffer. You've got it nicely folded in half for going on the bolt. And manufacturers want the fabric to be as pretty as possible on the bolt. They add that extra chemical, they add that extra sizing, so that way the fabric on the bolt looks as smooth and soft and perfect as possible. So that way it's more successful at selling, right? So when you bring it home and you wash it, it's going to go all wrinkly. And that then adds an extra whole step. And that is taking it from wrinkled back to smooth and flat and straight and stiff. And that process is starching and pressing. So if you want to hear the whole great quilting debate about starch and whether starch is good or bad for your quilts, make sure to listen to episode 34 because I nailed that topic down. I really talked about starch alternative and the whole bugs thing and the whole 9 yards of it. So definitely check out episode 34 and listen to that. In short, I think starch is perfectly fine. I do not think it is a bad chemical, and I use it in all of my fabrics in all of my quilts. And no, I have never found that that causes a problem or makes them more yummy to bugs ever. But it is an extra step. So if you buy fabric from the store, it's got that nice hand to it, and sometimes it feels just a little like, washing it, it's just going to take that much more time to wash it. It's going to go all wrinkly, and now I'm going to have to starch it and press it, and it is time consuming, right? I totally get that. I really, really understand that. But personally, I feel like taking away that question mark of whether you can wash your quilt when it's finished or not, I think it's worth it. That's just my opinion. Another thing that pre-washing does is it removes that crease line. So when you buy fabric, I'm holding up a fat quarter here, just in case you're listening to audio and you hear some rustling, that's what I'm doing. I'm holding up a fat quarter here. When you have fabric from the store, it's folded in half on the bolt and creased really firmly. Well, that crease line, when you open the fabric up, sometimes it does not want to go away. And particularly if that fabric has been folded and it's like deep in the bolt, like towards the very, very end, that's going to be really firmly set into the fabric. And unless you just press and press and press the heck out of it, it's not going to go away without pre-washing. I have some that early quilt, I remember cutting around that center crease line because it wouldn't go away. No matter how much I pressed it, no matter how much I fought with it, that crease line was staying in the fabric. But when you throw your fabric in the washing machine, it just gets wet, washes all that chemical, all those dyes away, and it gets rid of that crease line. So then you can use your entire full length of fabric and you can square it properly. So when you get that fabric off the bolt and it's been folded in half, that fold line might not necessarily be lining up straight and parallel with the grain lines in your fabric, right? So it could be off. And this can be really, really apparent whenever you have your fabric cut and then you wash it and the edges just go completely frayed and horrible. That is usually a sign that the fabric's been cut off grain. So let's say the fabric person that cut it probably lined up her ruler with that fold line that was in the fabric and cut across it. Well, that fold line was put in by a manufacturer, and that was just according to the machine. They didn't actually bother to get it up and square it. And I've got videos on squaring fabric and the fabric dance and that whole 9 yards, so make sure to find the show notes for this episode so that way you can see it. It's just a little extra step in the quilting process, and it makes sure that your fabric is square, meaning that the threads in the fabric are running straight, perpendicular or parallel with your cutting line. I know this sounds a little technical, but it's really important. It ensures that when you cut a long straight strip, you're not going to get like a little V or a little dip in it. Especially if it's across a fold line, it's going to be a perfectly straight strip all the way down. So, the only way to really cut your fabric with the grain line of fabric is to rip it. And I really prefer ripping. Basically, if you're at a quilt shop and you're getting fabric cut, if you can request having it ripped, some quilt shops will do that for you. Some are adamant cutters instead of rippers. I know it sounds terrible. The sound of ripping fabric is like fingernails on a chalkboard. But ripping ensures that the fabric is ripped on grain. So it is going to be parallel with those threads in the fabric. And usually when you rip fabric, it will fray far less whenever you wash it. So I'm holding up a fat quarter here, and this was from this month's Quilty Box, and it's some of Latifa Safir's fabric from Double Dutch, her collection. And I have lost about 1/2 inch off of this edge of the fat quarter, and the reason is it was cut instead of ripped. if this edge had been ripped, I would only be losing just a little bit of fuzz on that edge. And that's just the difference between ripping and cutting. You know, as the fabric is washed, those extra stray threads kind of start to work themselves out, and cutting seems to sever more of the threads because it's rarely cut perfectly on grain. So that's the reason why I prefer ripping instead. It does, have a little bit of a fuzzy edge, but when you wash it, it does not end up going super frayed. You don't end up losing quite so much off the edges of your fabric. So the debate can really get heated when it comes to pre-washing, when it comes to pre-cuts. So I have some fat quarters here. Fat eighths, I have washed fat eighths before. I do tend to see a lot of fraying on the edges, and that's already a fairly skinny piece. So you can lose a good bit on a fat eighth. I pretty much wouldn't go any smaller than a fat eighth as far as pre-washing. Like, I would not wash a layer cake. I wouldn't wash any sort of pre-cut strip or charm packs, anything like that. And the reason is it's just gonna turn into a tangled mess of threads. So pre-cut quilts automatically are going to be quilts that have that question mark built into them. How are you going to care for it at the end? Is it going to wash safely, or are those fabrics going to bleed? And this is something that I think you should start to think about and incorporate into your fabric colors. So let's say that you want to use a pre-cut pack of fabrics and they're all really bright, reds, blues, purples, all those bright colors. Instead of matching that with white, which will just show the bleeding really badly, if it does bleed, instead of choosing white, choose black background fabric. And that's going to hide it. So, if things bleed, if those dyes migrate, then it'll migrate onto black versus migrating onto white, which would be very noticeable. So you can get away with it, and how I would pre-wash a quilt, let's say, if I worked with pre-cuts and was not able to wash the fabric before the quilt was made, then I would put it in the washing machine. I would make sure to add 2 or 3 dye grabbers. I would wash it very fast, and I would immediately take it out of the washing machine and throw it in the dryer just as fast as you can, because the longer the quilt is wet, the longer those fabrics and those dyes kind of start to soften up and want to move. So, I don't look down on anyone that doesn't pre-wash their fabric. I get it. Time is of the essence, and we have a limited amount of time to work with and enjoy making quilts. And I certainly understand the desire to work with pre-cuts. Pre-cuts are fun, and you get so many beautiful fabrics in the pack and all that kind of good stuff. But please understand that it could have unintended consequences for your quilt. You finish that quilt, it's going to look one way. If it gets dirty, you're going to need to wash it, and then it might change. For one thing, the fabrics might shrink and change shape slightly. So instead of being nice and flat and smooth, those fabrics are going to shrink and crinkle up a little bit. That's just the natural shrinking process of cotton fabrics. If the dyes bleed, that can be an unintended consequence that you just absolutely have no control over. I have never had an issue with mixing washed fabric with unwashed fabric. That's never been an issue in my quilts. Sometimes I'll have like pre-cuts that are unwashed with washed background fabric. Never been a problem, to mix and match. Generally, I do try and always work with everything being pre-washed. But if I can't, then at least everything has been starched to the same amount. So if I have gone through and starched the fabric twice, then I'll make sure everything has been starched with 2 layers. And that's because when I go to piece, those fabrics will feel the same, meaning that they will all have the exact same amount of stretch and give as they're feeding through the machine. So I know that this might sound really picky and really detailed. I mean, I'm talking about the threads in the fabric. Does it even need to be that complicated? Personally, I think it does, because if you are wondering why your seams don't match and you're wondering why your strips aren't straight, it has a little V or a little dip in it, and you're wondering why these things are happening, it comes down to fabric. It comes down to how you prepare and start, and probably whether it is square when you cut it or not. If the piece is being cut accurately really depends on if it was prepared properly. Everything is a building process in quilting. And there are quilts that I just really don't care. I want to get it done, get it out. I don't care if it's perfect. I don't care if those seams match. But then there's other quilts that I make that I might want to compete with it. I might want to enter it into a quilt show. I want every single seam to match perfectly. I want to control everything about that quilt. And to me, it's important to be able to make the decision one way or the other. To have the ability to make something perfectly, but also have the ability to make a decision that you don't really want to go that far, that you don't want to put in all that effort. So I hope that all of that makes sense. And I really hope that you'll come and check out all the extra videos. I'll post a lot of extra videos to the show notes of this episode so you can see how I square fabric, how I wash it, how I starch it too, and also links to episode 34 and that whole starching debate. I do think that this is an important step in the quilt making process. However, lots and lots of quilters don't pre-wash their fabric, and they make beautiful quilts too. So understand that there's room for everybody. There is no right or wrong way to make a quilt, certainly not a right or wrong way to make a quilt. I simply want to help explain the quilting process. And if you're wanting to produce something and make something a certain way, kind of what steps are important to get you there. And I really think pre-washing is one of them. So if you've never done it, please give it a try this week. Now, if you do wash your fabric or you don't, share a picture. If you've got some fabric that's in process and you're getting ready to cut and make something really fun, make sure to post a picture of it and tag me at Leah Day Quilting on Instagram. You could also use the hashtag #HelloMyQuiltingFriends. I love to see your quilts, your quilting process, and how you're preparing your fabrics. Now, next week, we're going to have a terrific interview with Stephanie Sebbing. She also went to Quilt Market, but I'll really talk to her mostly about opening a quilt shop. She opened a studio first, then transformed it into a quilt shop in addition to running her online business. So I hope that you're looking forward to this new episode, episode 37, which will be coming up next week with Stephanie Sebbing. So if you enjoyed this episode, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. You can also subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss any new episodes coming out every Wednesday. You can also find all of the episodes linked together at leahday.com/podcast. Until next time, let's go quilt.